Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, April 5th at 1 o'clock Eastern Time, 10 a.m. Pacific Time, and this is Advancement Live. We are coming to you live from the James West Alumni Center at UCLA with a rare episode from the West Coast. And we thank UCLA alumni for their hospitality. We've specifically chosen this camera angle so that those of you on the East Coast can see what the sun looks like. I can guarantee you getting out of Ithaca yesterday.
So it doesn't look like snow.
It doesn't kind of look like snow. It's warm snow. Think of it that way. I'm your host, Andrew Gossen. And the reason that I'm on the West Coast today, and the reason that almost 300 alumni relations pros will be descending upon UCLA today and tomorrow, is the GG+A Global Leaders Summit. The conference schedule clearly has its eye on the future of alumni relations, and I thought it would make sense to tackle this same topic on today's episode of Advancement Live, since we've got some great thought leaders in town for the conference, and today's guests, Shaindlin and Sina, are two of the best. So we are going to have fun today. And this is a rare occasion when I get to be in the same room as the people I'm talking to, so I'm excited about that as well. But before we dive in, let me say some quick words of thanks to our sponsors and introduce today's guests. Advancement Live is part of the Higher Ed Live network, offering viewers direct access to the best and brightest minds in education. Live broadcasts allow viewers to share knowledge and participate in discussions around the most important issues in the industry. All episodes of Advancement Live are free and accessible in the video archives at higheredlive.com. and in podcast format on iTunes. Today's broadcast is made possible by iModules. Get the latest white paper from iModules to learn about online giving trends in higher education today, including 24-hour giving days, crowdfunding, average gift size, and more. iModules, we thank you, and we couldn't do this without you. Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a marketing and communications firm that works with education institutions on branding, strategy, web design, and more. Are you preparing for a web redesign project? Knowing that your website needs an overhaul isn't usually the problem. Getting started is. Download M. Stoner's helpful 7-step checklist to get you started on the right path for a successful website redesign. And with that, let me introduce today's guests. Sitting to my left is Sina. Julie became UCLA's Associate Vice Chancellor for Alumni Affairs in December of 2013. In partnership with the UCLA Alumni Association Board, Julie has overseen the adoption of a new alumni engagement model that has refocused alumni activity around regional and international work, young alumni involvement, attention to affinity and diversity networks, the continuum from student recruitment to career development, and closer ties to alumni efforts in the professional schools and the college. In addition to alumni affairs, Julie leads the Advancement Services Division and serves as CFO for the UCLA Foundation and UCLA Investment Company. Julie earned her PhD at Virginia Tech, and she has worked with Virginia Tech, University of Florida, University of the Pacific, Iowa State, and University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. Sitting to Julie's left is Shaindlin. Andy is a frequent guest on Advancement Live and a higher education executive with 26 years of international experience in institutional advancement, including alumni engagement, communications, and fundraising. Andy consults with a variety of organizations providing program assessment, recommendations on staffing and structure, organizational models, governance boards, and preparation for trends affecting nonprofits and networks. Andy is a frequent keynote speaker, conference presenter, and author on topics related to global advancement trends and the effects of technology on organizations and their members. He has chaired the Commission on Alumni Relations for the Council on the Advancement and Support of Education, and also served on the CASE Board of Trustees. So Andy and Julie, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for joining us. For those of you who are watching online, feel free to ask questions using the Higher Ed Live hashtag, and I will work those into the conversation as they pop in. But let's get things going. Let's start with Julie as our host. Julie, as you think about the next 12 to 18 months here at UCLA, what are the things that you're most excited about?
Well, I think, one of the things obviously is the continuation of this launch that we've had of this tremendous engagement model where we've really increased our involvement with our alumni around the universe, as we say, including a special focus on young alumni, as we talked about the work that we're doing in diversity programs. And the other piece for us is we don't call it new anymore, but we have a new membership model that is really focused around donations. We're at the request of our chancellor. Everyone is automatically a member, but then you can tier it up. And what you do at that point is a donation. We recently had a very successful, actually fundraising campaign around scholarships, where we partnered with our colleagues to raise about $450,000. So a new role around philanthropic culture for our alumni team and for our board, and then also our work around the business development to support the work that we do. So it's engagement, membership, and business development to support the work that we're doing.
How has your alumni audience responded to this shift in the model?
On the membership side, it's been amazing, because when the chancellor talks about you're automatically a member when you graduate from UCLA, or you're an extension certificate holder. That's the other piece that we added, particularly in the climate around funding. Our families and our students, our graduates, feel like they've already invested. And so there's a real appreciation for that acknowledgement. And the other piece that's resonated really well with our constituents, being our graduates or folks that feel they have a relationship to UCLA, our parents, our neighbors, is the option to be a donor, particularly around the scholarship piece, because you can choose to invest either in the alumni programmatic efforts or in the scholarship piece. And just as we predicted, folks are really resonating with the scholarship, the continuation of the legacy, and the business development focus is around our need to figure out how we're going to fund our programs. So it's a success, but it also presents a challenge.
Great. Sounds like an exciting time.
And very much so.
Like things are moving in a very positive
Very
direction.
much so.
Andy, let's move over to you. You spend a good bit of your time consulting, working internationally. What's going on outside of North America that American and Canadian alumni relations pros ought to be aware of?
It's actually, there's a couple of interesting things to note that I think North American advancement professionals should keep in mind and keep an eye on. One is the fact that overseas, where alumni relations, alumni associations, and alumni communities don't have a long, well-established, mature sort of history among higher education institutions, those institutions are finding that they don't need to do what a lot of North American institutions have to do, which is to overcome 100 years of well-established tradition or legacies or profiles that have to be replaced. They're actually building from scratch, and they have an opportunity to kind of address a blank slate. And so their programming is in a lot of ways able to leapfrog in a way what North American institutions are doing. And I think that because they are starting with a clean slate, because they don't have assumptions about the way it's always been, or, well, we've been doing this for 100 years, we can't just stop. They don't worry about that. And so they're able to actually invent new directions that are maybe not something that you could copy at a North American institution, because the context is so different, educationally, culturally, socially. But the methodology of being creative, being innovative, and coming to the table without any prior assumptions is actually a good one, I think, for everyone to try to follow. The other thing that's interesting is that, in the US, for example, there are literally thousands of post-secondary higher education institutions. And smaller countries like in the Netherlands with a few dozen institutions. All of Australia has fewer than 40 universities. New Zealand has 8 universities. They actually have an opportunity to partner and present their national educational effort as a brand overseas. And it's a tremendously powerful way of projecting a national education identity for the recruitment of international students, who of course become international alumni, who then represent their individual institutions, but also the national education brand overseas. So a project I just worked on for the Dutch government actually is aimed at strategically figuring out the balance between individual institutions' brands in the minds of their alumni and the national identity for what they call the Holland Alumni Network. Globally, as representative of Dutch higher education and its quality and its outcomes and its achievements. And so finding that balance is actually something that I don't think you could do systematically in the United States, because we don't have a national higher education system. Even within an individual state, like in California, you have several systems that have to work together. But that idea that institutions could collaborate with each other outside of their own region is potentially really powerful.
It also seems like there aren't pre-existing rivalries that might make it difficult for institutions to collaborate, even if it made sense on paper, just because they can't get over those hurdles.
There may or may not be in some cases. I think what I've seen is the one stumbling block potentially is that the institutional leaders still want their institution to be the primary brand.
Right.
Whereas
That we share in common.
so I think that's true everywhere where you're promoting this university. But in terms of outcomes, if it's more beneficial to a group of alumni in Beijing or in Sydney or in Lima to have an affiliation with a national identity, they'll gravitate in that direction because it's going to benefit them more professionally, socially, and in their networks. So again, context is different, but thinking about things in the context of, hey, it's not every institution against every other institution. It's a pooled network that represents the educational outcome that this system or this state or this country could achieve is actually a new way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
I'm just curious in terms of best practices that you've seen of U.S. institutions in terms of engaging their alumni internationally.
Again, context is everything. I think it's not only U.S. I think Canadian institutions, if you look at the University of British Columbia, heavily oriented toward the Pacific Rim, and rightly so because of their geographical location, but also their student recruitment profile and their alumni profile, their academic relationships, research partnerships, and so on. Having an awareness of just moving beyond just the numbers. So you see a lot of institutions that say, well, overseas alumni only make up 6% of our alumni population. But looking at who they are, because very often the the stamp of approval of having a degree, especially an advanced degree, from a prominent research institution in North America can give an individual extra influence, visibility, or a higher profile in their home country. And so being aware that you may have a smaller number of alumni, but you need to look at what positions they occupy, what their networks are able to give you access to as an institution is actually really important. So I think focusing more on, who's in the network and what kind of influence and access do they provide for the institution and its mission is more important than simply saying, we have 10% of our alums overseas, we're going to put 10% of our budget into that.
Right, and we've done X number of programs with X number of participants.
Yeah, and the other thing is, of course, that as you get farther away from your physical campus, you find that people's desire and responsiveness to invitations to participate is actually stronger because they don't have as many opportunities. It's not right in their backyard, and they don't have that tendency that you see a lot in I think in North American campuses for alumni to say, well, it's right down the road. I could always go to a program there. So I won't go this month, I'll go next month. And then next month, the alumni say the same thing. And as a result, the alumni who live nearby never participate, and people who live farther away are actually more willing to engage.
Well, that's something we've really tried to focus on is how can we make participation and engagement not so Westwood centric? Because one of the challenges that we face in LA is, as folks know who have driven here, is that we never look at things by miles because 5 miles can take 45 minutes or an hour. So folks live in the valley, they're not always inclined to come back to campus. Then you have the issues in terms of parking and everything. So one of the things that we're very cognizant of how can we make everything we do one, transparent, but also available to alumni around the globe. So we've really become very aggressive about utilizing our YouTube channel, using programs like this, using our Google Hangouts. And one of the programs that we've done international, which has really been successful, is we do, I think it's about once a month or so, we'll do a program we call Living Globally, which we do in a Google Hangout kind of a format. And we have alums around the world talk about what it's like to do a job search, how you make those connections, what the brochure tells you versus what the brochure doesn't tell you. And so that's been really helpful for us. But everything that we do, we always ask ourselves, how can we make it available to folks that are not able to make it to that location, regardless of what it is?
And I think this is the type of programming that shows, as opposed to that this actually is a global community of people who are mutually invested in each other. We're in the launch phase of Cornell's second Giving Day, which will be happening on April 19th. And we're putting...
Is that alumni driven?
It is not alumni driven, but we're trying very hard. We have a 24-hour webcast that runs throughout the extent of Giving Day. And so during the early morning hours, we're trying very hard to recruit not only international alumni who can tell the community what they're doing, but we're also looking for students who are actually studying abroad who may be able to dial in and share with the audience what they're doing and how alumni support influences their ability to be in Madagascar studying whatever it is they're studying, so on and so forth. So I think we're just beginning to touch the tip of the iceberg here in terms of the potential of these tools for really engaging a truly global audience, which is exciting.
It's something you just said. It really applies to a lot of things, not just digital engagements, but programming in general. But it's always worth mentioning. It's one of those things you say it and everybody goes, well, yeah, of course. But then when you look at actual programs, they don't always feature this, which is talking about the benefits, not the features. That old sales thing, which is you're saying sort of these are the outcomes. This is the value of you being part of this global community. It's tangible, it's measurable, it's visible, as opposed to just telling somebody, you're part of a network of 300,000 people worldwide. Okay, so what? As opposed to, you can use this network to achieve the goals that you've set for yourself, and here's how to do it.
That's right. No, I totally agree with you. It's a different kind of metric.
And I think there's another dimension to this as well, which is that it's not just a question of the center providing things to the periphery in terms of access to content and so on and so forth, but with a truly networked global audience, people who are living internationally have an opportunity to contribute to the campus and to the advancement effort that they might not otherwise. I think of two examples, one of which is actually, it came from Columbia, when Columbia got their Giving Day going and they first built out their social media ambassador program. One of the most influential ambassadors was actually somebody who lived in Asia, who lived far away from any other Columbia alum. So by normal standards, it would have been possible for her to engage with the Columbia alumni community in a meaningful way. But by virtue of having an internet connection and a great network,
an experience that was value added for her.
Well, exactly.
I think that's the key piece, is how do you make that connection?
Right. And as we're putting together Cornell Giving Day right now, we realize that there are particular people in particular countries, once again in Asia, who are deeply networked with the local alumni community in a way that we, the professional staff, are not. And that by asking them to help us and then giving them a chance to work their networks, and we have an international challenge that's going to provide the carrot that they collectively can work towards, they can actually make a substantial difference for a one-day giving campaign like that. So I think the future is bright when it comes to international engagement. Let's move on now to a topic that we've been seeing addressed with increasing frequency recently. This has to do with the appropriate relationship between alumni relations and fundraising. And in early January, there was a blog post that was analyzing some findings from VAES, the Voluntary Alumni Engagement in Support of Education survey, that have been interpreted to indicate that alumni relations is becoming too subordinate to fundraising. And some people have been saying, yes, this is true, we're upset about it. Other people have been saying, you know what, maybe that's not such a bad thing. What's your take on this conversation? Is this something new happening, or is this just the latest installment in a conversation that's actually been going on for decades?
I can speak to, be very UCLA specific for a moment, because that is something about our culture within our external affairs or our advancement division that we have really worked on intentionally changing. And a part of that is driven by wanting, quite frankly, to increase our alumni giving rate, which was also the other driver behind the change in our membership model to have it be a donation versus it's no longer about membership. And what it did, I mentioned this earlier, is it really has shifted so that this alumni team here is really now part of the philanthropic culture of the organization. So I think for us, it's more about, how do we, if you will, claim our place at the table? Because we are now, it's beyond just stewarding those relationships that then our fundraisers follow up on. We are actually a part of that stewardship and a part of that ask, on an annual fund type of a level typically. But for example, in this recent crowdfunding campaign that we did, we piloted, it's sort of lead up to a giving day for us, but we had 17 of our networks, and they were geographic, they were diversity, they were interest group that engaged in this grassroots fundraising that they actually owned. And we partnered with our regional giving team to line up some gifts in advance. So we knew we were going to meet our goal. But that has, and at the end of this year, we are cautiously optimistic that we will have moved our alumni giving needle back up to double digits. And it's really, and very acknowledged by everyone at the table in our organization, from our leadership, from our campaign steering committee, we're halfway through our campaign, our centennial campaign, our development colleagues, our alumni team, that we all now have a stake in this philanthropic culture. So I think for me, it goes back to, I spent most of my career in student affairs, and as a student affairs practitioner, I was always like, how do we help the greater university community understand what our role is?
Mm-hmm.
It's not only when there's a crisis, it's not only when something goes wrong, it's we are a key part of this institutional fabric. And I find the same to be true about this alumni organization, is we are a key part of the philanthropic fabric of the university. But we need to show folks, here's what we bring.
Mm-hmm.
And that's on us. So that's what we've done with that kind of a piece. Is I think we're very much a player in that conversation now. Again, we are not bringing in the $100 million gift, but our development colleagues understand we may be introducing them to somebody who does.
Right. Sure.
So that's part of making sure that we're in the middle of those conversations versus waiting to respond or jump in.
Sure.
If that makes sense.
Sure.
And to pick up on your metaphor of the part of the fabric,
Yeah.
The implication there is that it's all woven together, interlocking
Exactly.
threads, as opposed to two separate pieces of fabric
Exactly.
that somehow have to be stitched together because otherwise they don't match up or align or connect, which isn't the case. And in fact, as we've discussed, Andrew, if you go to alumni and say, if you've ever been to a cocktail party where you said, oh, I work in alumni relations, people immediately assume that you're a fundraiser, that you're there to solicit gifts, or that
You've
that's
made
what
all
your
those
job
calls.
is. You're the person who interrupted their dinner or whatever.
Exactly.
But the point is that it's not shocking or surprising to alumni
Mhm.
to suddenly discover that their alumni community, their alumni association, their alumni relations office is somehow in league with development, as if that was a sneaky surprise that we sprung on them. Quite the opposite. So alumni are starting with the assumption that it is all one effort and that it ought to be, and that makes sense. So the debate, I think, that as you point out, sort of recently has bubbled again in a kind of a visible way to the surface, is really an internal debate among ourselves, and that our audience members, in the meantime, are off engaging with other organizations because we're spending time debating whether alumni
And assuming that they
relations
know our org charts.
Well, they don't care. They don't care.
Exactly.
They don't care.
Exactly.
They don't care. And I guess my other point is that saying that something is, what's the relationship between these offices, almost to me doesn't make sense.
Right.
Because you're suggesting that they're doing different things for different purposes. The shared part of the mission between development and alumni relations at almost every institution that I know of is to support the institution. The way in which the support you generate manifests itself can differ, but the goal is the same at a high level. There's an additional component of it for alumni engagement, which is to serve the alumni as well.
Yes.
So you've got this other layer, that kind of two-way street, and it should be seen that way, it should be presented that way, and I think that that's a message that resonates with alumni because, as you said, Julie, you're reaching out to people and they're saying, oh wow, you actually do value us as a part of this community. It's not just that we're the ATM that you come to and get cash out of. So saying that something is subordinate to something else, it to me kind of doesn't make sense. And I think that the conversation is more intense now because resources are constrained. The budgets are tighter. I've been in alumni relations since 1989. And in the early 90s, the budgets were pretty robust. And you could go to the executive director or the VP and say, hey, we really need an extra position in clubs and chapters. And it wasn't that big a debate. Now you go and say that, and the debate is, all right, but we can only add one position in advancement.
Yeah, what are you going to give up to do that?
Should it be a major gift officer or should it be an alumni engagement officer? So the focus has shifted from doing something because it's separate to talking about doing something because it's not separate, because it's integrated. That's how you show the value. That's how you explain what you're bringing to the table, and where the benefit is to the institution and ultimately to the alumni. But having an argument that, it sounds like a political debate, like we're going to build a wall and development's going to pay for it. It's kind of not really productive in my opinion.
The other thing I would add to, and again, this comes from my work in my previous areas on campus, is that also one of the things that the conversation have a lot with our board as well as with the alumni team here is, how can we show folks what our value add is? And one of the ways that we've done that truly has been around the metrics area, because I think even within this organization, we're measured differently. And use this crowdfunding campaign recently as an example. When it came to bringing in those gifts and the bottom line, as I said to our development colleagues when we had a little bit of a kerfuffle one day, I said, you can own these metrics. Take credit for all of these gifts. You own them. The alumni folks are measured in different ways. You know, it's about the relationship. It's about sustaining those relationships, and then how do we account for that as well? And the other thing that we've done, which is incredibly value added to our development colleagues, is our alumni staff now files contact reports.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, if within our CRM tool, if we have a conversation, you know, whether difficult or really positive, or we learn some information, all of our entire team here is trained in utilizing, you know, that same tool
right.
that our development officers use. And now we're getting some good feedback about, hey, that was really helpful
mm-hmm.
to know that you talked with so-and-so about this, because I'm having a similar conversation. Right. And so the sharing of information now has become seamless.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that other value add. And I think, again, within the organization, whether, you know, quite frankly, one would agree or not, for me, what I tell the alumni team is we've got to bring the value add. Yep. And once it's there, we're there.
I think in terms of the value, then someone's going to say, well, how do you measure it? Because you mentioned metrics.
Yep.
And there is room, and I've been saying this for a couple of years in presentations, that not everything, you know, there's this concept that measurement is somehow inherently accurate, that you need to be able to insert a decimal point somewhere in order for your measurements to be meaningful or useful. And in fact, I think because we're talking about relationships, that the way we actually assess relationships think about your personal life, right? You don't score your marriage and say like 38.9 or whatever, you know.
Well, you might, but that works so well for you.
But if you did, you would find that maybe that wasn't how people expect you to approach it. And my point is that the relationship component can, in part, be judged, not measured. That we judge it subjectively based on our expectations, based on how we feel it's going, and we bake that into our assessment of our overall outcomes, along with critical, quantitative, analytical look at data. I'm not saying we don't do that. You have to do that, and that should be the primary. But there is room for a little bit of judgment as well as a lot of measurement, and that's something that I think is okay.
Well, particularly
we're in the process of sort of sorting out how much is measurement and how much is judgment, and what's okay.
Well, I think the measurement piece does become key. It's the issue you raised earlier around the budget piece. It's, you know, again, it's us being able to talk in the same language as our colleagues do, who are looking at where we're going to invest in. So I think that is the conversation that you just brought up that we've had recently here is we appreciate the metric, but how do we insert the qualitative?
And I think you can, if you set yourself a task, make a philosophical case that the two ought to be separate, right? Although I would argue, Andy and I were talking about this before we went live, that being able to make that case may indicate that your institution has a certain amount of wealth already, because it's a privileged point of view. I think to say like,
we can't have that yet.
Do we want to be separate? We could if we wanted to. And the vast majority of institutions, think about small and medium-sized public universities, their staffing levels, their budget for alumni engagement are such that they don't have the option of saying, we choose not to engage with development. They've got to be part of an integrated advancement team that shares goals, achieves them in different ways, but at the end of the day gets back to the same finish line at the same time.
Well, the value add of all the information, you know, again, regardless of the structure, just makes for I think such a much more robust kind of a relationship moving forward. So that better serves the institution.
I totally agree. And I think from the be careful what you wish for files, that there is in today's climate a danger in deliberately aligning yourself or presenting yourself as a cost center as opposed to a revenue center. And certainly different strokes for different folks, but
you want to be able to tell people how you can be both.
Exactly. Fantastic. So we talked a little bit about ROI, and let's actually jump to this as the next question. Is it your sense that the pressures to engage with senior leadership at the university level about ROI are changing? And if so, do you see any new approaches to having these conversations in a productive way beginning to emerge?
For us, I would take it from a bit of a different, where ROI, I can't even say it, where ROI has become a forefront of a conversation with us is actually with our board.
Okay.
You know, as we've changed our model for how we work, and our board is working with us to invest more. Alumni Association Board. Thank you. Yes, the Alumni Association Board has actually tasked us as a staff to build a dashboard that shows what our return on investment is for this new engagement model. And looking at things like how it impacts giving, how it impacts leadership, how it impacts people attending, people returning for attendance. So we've set up a whole series of multiple levels of metrics that look at what is the return on investment, because our alumni board has had to actually dip into our endowment to fund this new model while our new membership and business development areas kind of level out. So they've become very focused on what's the ROI and utilizing that as a decision-making process in terms of how we go forward. And they've been incredible partners in it. But again, it's really challenged us to rethink and to think about how we do certain things. So we're feeling that pressure more from the board, not as from the alumni board again, not so much from the the leadership of the external affairs or advancement organization or the other leadership.
I think there's a couple of layers that you hit on here which are important. First is actually just getting the data. So the idea, if you're going to show ROI, the return has to be defined in advance.
Exactly.
Because what you see in your alumni shop as valuable may not look that way to somebody who has a different mandate, a more quantitative model for measurement or something else.
Well, and even having that conversation is key.
So you need to set a shared expectation as to what kind of return is viable or reasonable or valuable. Then once you do that, you've got to go about actually recording data that will show that degree to which you've moved the needle in that direction.
Exactly.
And what's interesting to me is there's still a lot of, one thing we do at GG+A in our consulting business, the first thing we do when we engage, Julie, as you know, is to ask the client organization to provide us with a lot of data,
That's right.
a lot of metrics, a lot of information. And what we see a lot is that what organizations are recording to assess their success are in fact not outcomes, they're inputs.
Right.
So this idea that we got more people to join the LinkedIn group, or this many people downloaded our app or came to events. The question that we then push toward is, okay, good to know. Now, given that these people engaged in that way, what else can you correlate their engagement with? What other outcomes or behaviors have they exhibited? And to do that, you actually need to know who they are.
So that's exactly what is driven our dashboard. You're exactly right.
So this implies an investment internally in staff to not only record the data, but you need some analytics expertise now. And the phrase that I hear more and more often when talking with alumni associations is business intelligence.
That's right.
So this is something that's now kind of made its way into our sector and is becoming visible. And people are still sort of scratching their heads and saying, what does it mean in the context of an alumni community engagement?
And why does it matter?
And even if we measure it and show that it took place, what outcomes is it associated with? So I think that the ultimate kind of goal is to correlate these inputs. People did X, they behaved a certain way, with outcomes. And as a result of having done that, they are 2.5 times more likely to be a volunteer or to attend a regional event or to recruit a student or to hire a student or to make a gift.
That's right.
And all of those outcomes are things to measure.
This is a really interesting point that relates to our previous conversation, which is that unless you're in an integrated model where you're actually all thinking together about this, you can't do that. You can hire as many data analysts as you want, and unless they understand the complete picture, they can't.
Well, then what you're measuring becomes a much smaller sphere.
It's an internal benchmarking project as opposed to something that connects those internal achievements with the rest of your institution and the outside world.
Well, and I think one of the things that we have found and that I plan to continue to really work on as this model evolves is, even if folks aren't convinced of what that value add is, doing this right draws the picture.
Yep. And it draws the picture in such a way that you can actually take this type of work and turn it into content that you then share with your audience to reflect who they are and what they're actually doing and the impact they're having. And I think that's when we're getting down to actual direct impact on the institution.
Exactly.
Right? When we can create this virtuous cycle where they see that they're making a difference and then they get more.
And also from the alumni perspective, what it is that we bring to the table again, so.
Right. And from the point of view of volunteers, alumni at large, donors, impact, your word, is critical, right? So when you look at the research into what it is that motivates or what desired outcome, especially recent grads have for being financially supportive or engaging, they need to know what impact their participation is going to have. And so translating their presence in this community into some outcome that is visible and tangible and explainable is important. It's still up to them at the end to decide whether that's something they care about and that they think is more valuable than some other opportunity they have to engage with a different organization. but at least you're able to show, hey, your participation has an impact.
Mhm.
Here's what it is, and as a result of that impact, here's what the institution and its people are able to achieve.
That's right.
Mhm. So you mentioned young alumni. Let's pivot and talk about young alumni for a bit. There's been plenty of conversation out there in advancement circles and in the broader world beyond about young alumni, millennials. Are they truly different? Are they a homogenous, undifferentiated group of people about whom we can say they do X, Y, or Z? How different do you think this new generation of alumni actually is? And as a follow-on from that, do you think that we're doing enough to invest in young alumni programs?
You know, we learned a lot about this a couple of years ago, and we actually launched this engagement model that we're currently have now embedded in about 3 years ago. And one of the recommendations that came to us was you have almost 50% of your alumni, because we're not yet 100 years old at UCLA. So almost 50% of our alumni are under the age of 40. And we were doing at that point in time absolutely no intentional programming for that group. And so before we decided we knew best what was for them, we actually did a number of focus groups around the country that were exceptionally helpful. And what we learned from these groups was why young alumni were not engaging. And a lot of it was because they didn't perceive anything that we did that was for them. And in fact, we interviewed, I'll never forget, one weekend we were in the Bay Area having a game with Stanford, which Jim Moore has not come away with victoriously yet. That's another issue. But I digress. And we were interviewing a series of young alumni in the Bay Area. And we asked them, we were doing a huge gathering the next day for our alumni. And are you coming? No, that's for older people. We're not going to participate in that. We learned that they would rather watch a game with their friends on social media in different locations than come to this event that we were sponsoring. And yet outside our huge event was a huge gathering of our young alumni, because they wanted to take advantage of all the stuff that was going on at ours, but they didn't want to be part of it. And so we learned a lot about what are they interested in? How do they want to participate? What are programs that they would attend? And we've launched a series of programs that have been tremendously successful. Things like Bruin Foodies, Bruin experiences through the lifespan, and also done them both on-site, various locations around the country, around the world, have connected some of our standard programs in a way that they told us would be more appealing for them. And then the other piece, of course, that is absolutely huge is the career program.
Right.
And so we learned a lot by asking first. And have experienced, I think, some really fabulous success by doing some things that were really appealing to them within a format that worked for our younger alumni. And we define young alumni as recent grads through mid-30s.
Okay. Who would have thought that simply by asking people?
Oh, yeah.
What a concept. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, and of course,
But asking them isn't really the hard part. A lot of people do surveys, right? Actually listening.
Yeah. And this was in person. We decided not to do a survey. We decided to do
focus groups.
Yeah.
So that idea that you'll take what you hear and not simply sort of chalk it up as a success by saying, we got a lot of feedback, but actually baking it into your program design and your strategic planning is really hard to do.
And the perception across the board, which was tough for our staff to hear at the time and tough even for our alumni leaders to hear, is everything you do is for people over 50. So, which of course I struggle with the fact that they thought that was old, but anyway.
Welcome to the club. But to them it is old,
It
right?
is old,
So
exactly.
and it's not a judgment, it's not good or bad, it's just sort of
It's
a
what it
perception that you have to bake into your planning and your decision making about what programs to prioritize. I think that that's the one aspect of it. The other is kind of on a higher level to step back and remember that it's not entirely about your institution. It's not about the association of alumni. And to your point, Andrew, it's more of a, if you can paint with a little bit of a broad brush, I think my observation is that more recent alumni, the younger generation of graduates, do have a different expectation about formal organizations.
I think that's an excellent point.
And I saw this because when I worked at the University of Michigan, which is a membership dues-based association, quite a large one, there was a very clear divide in the data that we looked at that showed, saw the same thing at Caltech, another membership association, that showed that people who were baby boomers or older were likely to join or donate or participate because it's the right thing to do. You ought to do that because you should be loyal. That's what a community member does. And that as you get more and more recent, there is an increased tendency to ask a question up front where the audience member says, okay, sure, I love the place, I'll engage, what's in it for me? not in a cynical way, but
Right.
just in a pragmatic way, which is, look, I've got a limited amount of time
That's right.
or money to invest. What's the payoff? So it's back to ROI from their point of view.
Yeah.
And,
Oh, I would
and
add attention span to that.
Mhm.
I mean, that's the other piece.
Well, attention spans, partially because, you're right, because the landscape is more cluttered.
Right.
It's more competitive to get people's attention, because any organization now, especially with the advent of a lot of online tools like event management tools, social media, but also now crowdfunding platforms, make it possible for little organizations or even individuals to execute functions that previously, for old people like me, were the domain of organizations.
Yeah, no, you're
You
right.
needed a staff to do a fundraising campaign. Now you just need a Kickstarter account or Indiegogo or whatever, and off you go. So it's more crowded, it's more competitive, and you're in a race against many other organizations and individuals. So all of those things kind of form this set of influences that make it harder to get people's attention. And then once you have their attention, they're much more focused on it. You've got a very limited amount of time to make your case and to engage them. And if you miss that, they're gone.
You know, the other thing we ran into when we did this, because again, when we've gone through, as I'm implying, a significant organizational change within a fairly quick period of time. The other thing we heard from people as we were all of a sudden stepping up this engagement model is, I haven't heard from you in years. Why now? What's different? You know, again, it's that precious commodity of time and involvement.
And that's only a scary question if you don't have a good answer.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, exactly.
You should welcome the opportunity.
Exactly.
But thank God we finally can tell them
Yeah.
what we really
I
want them.
feel like this is a high stakes interaction, and that you have a chance to demonstrate your credibility, right? I mean, if you listen and then you act and they see that, I think once again you've got a nice virtuous cycle coming into being. But if you blow it, then
well, and that's
it's
the
hard to
other
get a
issue that
second
we talk
chance.
about a lot is the sustainability.
Right.
It can't, because there was also once even somebody that would make a commitment. It's like, yeah, this is one shot, but I'm never going to hear from you again. So how do you have those successful, really ongoing, continual engagement platforms on multiple levels based on people's learning curves and their interest, that helps folks, whether they choose or not to participate, at least have that sense of, I have those choices, and I'm going to continue to be engaged, even if I'm an engaged observer.
One of the most interesting conversations I've had over the past year was I was talking to a colleague of mine at the Cornell Annual Fund, Jen Bukowski, and we were talking through why it's so difficult to actually think in a productive way about Gen Xers. And her point was that the reason we're having a hard time with Gen X right now is because we weren't investing appropriately in young alumni programming 20 years ago. And I thought, you know what, that actually, that makes a lot of sense when you think about it. So just the fact that we're having these conversations now and that investments are being made suggests that 20 years from now, people may not be having the same conversations about the damn 40-year-olds.
Yeah.
They'll be pointing out something else we failed to do.
Exactly.
But we don't know what that is yet.
So let's
And I'm okay with that.
Yeah,
One thing at a time.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
let's shift gears now and focus directly on the career issue. We've alluded to it in a variety of contexts now, and I promised Ryan Catherwood that we would talk about this. So careers, it feels to me like careers is an obvious need from the perspective of the alumni, especially in recent economies, in today's economy. There are people dealing with careers on campus, but there seems to be a reluctance on the part of most of the people who deal with careers on campus to actually join together and think about this in a structured and systemic way and make appropriate investments and build this into a core element of what we do when we're engaging our student and alumni constituencies. So Julie tackled this recently. How have you thought through that series of issues here?
Well, I think one of the challenges, particularly in a public institution, is around the funding, and how are all those various campus partners funded, and are they funded in a way that it really fuels a partnership? And that's where we hit a little bit of a wall, at least from the UC perspective, in terms of how our Student Career Center is funded by student fee revenue, which really impacts the reach of their services. So there was some we weren't able to partner as far as we wanted to in terms of some of the alumni services. So that led us to one of course continue to have our student affairs colleagues as incredibly strong partners, and they are, but also look for how can we really serve our alumni in a way that's going to meet the needs of our alumni, and again, globally, and with some sense of immediacy. So we have a wonderful partner in our Dean of Extension, who came to us from World College at Penn State, And so he works in a tech world that is still sort of new to me. But one of the things that we agreed to do very quickly was to look for what's the way that we can provide career support to our alumni, again, for us alumni is our extension certificate holders and our degree holders, in a virtual way. And so that's what led us to really to work with this Graduate platform, which we're now using in a form we call UCLA One. And we've had tremendous success with it. And again, we've modified it to suit our purposes, which are we did a soft launch. We run our full mentoring program through there. I went in the first day of that soft launch. We had almost 2,000 folks get into it. We now use the platform, which is something our alumni have asked for years, as alumni to alumni connections throughout the career lifespan. So we have a section for Bruin-owned businesses to support our business owners. We have opportunities to check in for one-shot mentoring, coaching. We've had alumni board members that have come back to us and said that they've made connections for internships. So it's really working for us in a way that really builds and sustains relationships. And it also fits with our current CRM model, which is really fabulous for us. So we're really utilizing our UCLA One platform as a virtual career center. And the other piece that's been really critical to success for us is really rethinking how we do the staffing and the programmatic aspects of careers. We had a wonderful opportunity about a year ago to have a team that was really largely focused on academic partnerships in terms of working with faculty, working with opportunities of bringing alumni into the classroom, connecting our students with alums, called the UCLA Partnership Program, at the direction of our provost. They've become now part of our alumni staff. And so we have a very robust team that really has brought together the academic units and the alumni units. So our programming, both on-site, in the classroom, as well as through this virtual center, is something that we're experiencing some very early and hopefully some expanded success in. But that's the route that we decided we needed to go. And it so far is working extremely well for us.
So I'll put you on the spot
Right.
a little bit to go back to the conversation we were having 5 minutes ago about outcomes, right? Which is, so your initial success is based on the initial behaviors of people interacting in a certain way, and that is positive.
Right.
And what is incumbent now on somebody in your position is to actually track that and follow it through and keep assessing and be honest internally about measurements and successes, to set targets for engagement. How many people do we need to do X and how many people do we expect, even if those are somewhat arbitrary. So you're at least benchmarking yourself over time, and to revisit that periodically and say, yeah, we had some success. Is it enough? How do we know? What is enough? What's the definition? And then to get acknowledgement from your campus partners about the definition of success and so on. So strategically, I think that's the piece that, that again, converting those inputs into outcomes that you actually, you have to wait a while. And one of the things about careers,
and the whole notion of not only just for our recent grads, but it's that notion of the relationship for the lifespan. That's a piece also that's got to be part of that metric.
That's right. And there are some institutions that have kind of focused on their mid-career alumni as a target audience for careers support. And notice I didn't say career services, so I stopped myself. And that was the other point I wanted to make, which is that language on campuses around career services, to me at least mentally, like when you say services, it's almost like you're suggesting that a person shows up, they come in, you serve them something, and then they go away and their problem is solved. And this idea that you can service somebody in the area of careers is I think, misleading. I think it creates a false sense. And one thing I picked up on recently from my friend and colleague Sheila Curran, who looks at this topic quite closely, is language around career outcomes. And if you simply change the way you have a conversation with somebody about, instead of saying career services, where you think of that room in that building on that campus, and you think about career outcomes, now you're talking about what happens not inside your organization. You're talking about what happens out in the world. And mentally, that's like a really important construct because it changes the frame of reference by which people are assessing their success. So career outcomes is one thing. Another phrase that we hear more and more is career community. This idea that it's not a counselor's job in a 30-minute appointment to set you up with your career. It's your responsibility as a member of a community. The good news is the community is global. The good news is the community is now accessible because of tools like digital tools. The good news is that the community is diverse and quite large.
Well, it's
So you
segments in
have
very interesting
these-
ways, which again, if you go this route, it's not always within your ability to control. So that's the other piece.
Mhm.
In terms of by field, by profession, by workplace, by.
Right, and I think you have to break it down into those segments to make it scalable. Because when you're talking about an institution, even a medium-sized public institution, but a very large public campus like UCLA, scalability for some specific services like mentoring
That's right.
is an issue. Technology can help to some extent, but at the end of the day, you have to set a realistic expectation about how many people want or need to engage in a particular type of interaction, like, say, mentoring or being mentored. And at what point are you satisfied with that?
Right.
And you're not going to get 100% of your global population to offer to be mentors. That's okay. What percent could you get? And when is it not okay? When are you failing to meet your goals? And more importantly, when are you failing to meet the expectations of the members of your community?
Well, we've had a lot of conversations about, which I'm sure, I appreciate your thoughts on as well, so how do you define what that is? I mean, in previous to launching this virtual piece, we had a definition around the expectations for what the mentoring relationship was, what's the length of the relationship, what's the activity, and once you do that virtually, some folks are struggling with giving that up.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
But I think that this idea of shifting the language and shifting the framework away from the model of the one-on-one half-hour session, which honestly, I think part of the cultural challenge we've had with this conversation on campuses is that many of the people in the career services offices are deeply invested in that model of doing it. And the problem is that fundamentally does not scale. And once you get to an alumni body of a certain size, it never will scale.
Even the student body can't be served on most campuses.
Well, and I think the other challenge is the fee-driven piece. And again, we're hoping, our long-term hope is that we'll build something that we'll be able to acquire some sponsorship to support this. But that's the other piece, because that's some of the feedback that we've gotten from alums who are in a position, wherever they are, whether it's a recent grad or somebody mid-career, that can't afford a fee-based model. So how do we do all of this? How do we support that?
Right. The other aspect, which Julie's in a better position to comment on than I am, because you worked in student affairs, you have a background in student affairs, is that culturally, the mindset of student affairs professionals, their training, their education is different from, it's more structured, systematic, and linear along models and theories, whereas people who come into advancement probably didn't, when they were 10 years old, didn't say, I want to be an alumni director when I grow up. You end up in that position. And it's quite rewarding, but the difference is that you come to it from any one of a number of completely unstructured, formatted, kind of frameless paths. And as a result, alumni professionals, and I'm stereotyping here, tend to be more sort of all over the map when it comes to how to think about career activities, whereas student affairs professionals are very much of similar mindsets across institutions. And so that structured, systematic approach versus that kind of free-form, chaotic approach, when they get together in practical terms, you can find a lot of agreement up at the strategic level, like this is what we want to achieve, this would be ideal. And then when it comes to implementation, the way that the work gets done tends to diverge. And that makes it harder for the groups to collaborate. Even if they like each other, they get along, they have the best of intentions, functionally getting stuff done when you've got those two different approaches to the work model is really difficult for the best manager or the best leader. And that's one of the reasons I think we haven't seen a kind of several institutions kind of clearly set the gold standard that we know will work. It's still a work in progress, and we're still figuring it out.
I mean, I actually do think that there's probably, and one of the things, and the reason I say that is because coming into this alumni work, it does remind me a lot of my student affairs work. There's many similarities there. I think really the bigger hurdle for us, quite frankly, is to, and I'm not giving up on this because I think we'll get there, is again to convince all of our campus partners there's enough value add at the table for all of us. It means that all of us are going to have to work a little bit differently, and it's I think the willingness to do that is holding folks behind. I mean, I think that's where, for us anyway at UCLA, finding this incredible partner in our extension colleague is what's been helped us to move along pretty quickly. Still keeping our student affairs folks at the table, but hopefully we'll all be at that same place at some point. So.
Breaks my heart to see that we are close to the end of our hour because I've really been enjoying this conversation. But I think we have time for one more question. And since I know that a large part of the Advancement Live audience is mid-career professionals who really care about this work, I was wondering if I could ask the two of you to share some thoughts about if you're a mid-level person who's looking to someday be the head of an alumni relations shop, for instance, what are the sorts of things that you would recommend that they focus on doing, perhaps outside of their day-to-day routine?
Well, one thing is to make sure you actually have information and awareness of what else is going on in the profession from other institutions. Mm-hmm. So attending conferences, participating as a speaker, reading the Twitter feed to see what your colleagues and professionals are concerned about and how they're solving problems. Having that network is really important. There are different ways to do that, but staying inside your silo in your campus is not going to give you the exposure to fresh ideas or different approaches that you're going to need. The second thing is to become as knowledgeable and familiar as possible with other parts of the enterprise. So you could know a lot about alumni relations. You may even know something about development and a little bit about communications. It's not enough. That to truly advance and to become a leader, you need to understand university finances. That's right. Governance is incredibly important. Academic structures and curricular decisions and things that go into student affairs, admissions, enrollment, financial aid, all of those things that go into these complex institutions will give you more influence and more success, frankly, at the table when you're interacting with other people at your institution. I didn't even realize that really for myself until I went to grad school in my 40s. And getting a master's degree in education actually exposed me to how little I knew about what was going on outside of my alumni bubble. So that's critical. The last thing I would say is to remember that you weren't hired, and if you get promoted or hired into a more senior position, it will not be because your boss wants you to keep everything exactly the same. And that your MO and your raison d'etre is really to figure out what needs to change, how it needs to change, and what you need to do to affect that change. And so thinking about innovation and creativity and risk-taking and experimentation should be at the front of your agenda every Monday morning.
There's only two things I would add. I love everything that you said. The first is that, particularly in the alumni world, get some experience in working with volunteer leadership and board management. That's key. If you let that go awry, you lose everything.
Absolutely. Boards.
Yeah. The other piece, and I know that folks may agree to disagree with me about this, but at the end of the day, it's a business. Mm-hmm. You know, and I think
completely
sometimes
agree.
In education, you know, yes, the relationships are important, sustainability is important, the warm and fuzzies are important, but at the end of the day, it's a business.
Mm-hmm. Couldn't agree more.
That's antithetical to my student affairs background.
It's all right.
I agree with everything that's been said, and the only thing that I would throw on the table is not to neglect the politics, and I don't mean that in the sense that you ought to spend lots of time around the water cooler stirring up trouble and so on and so forth, but to Andy's point about getting things done, you need other people to get things done. There is no way in the world that anybody is smart enough and energetic enough to do this all on their own, naturally, guests accepted naturally. Yeah. And oftentimes I think in this world where we're in a very hybrid, fluid environment, the people and the ideas that you need to actually be proactive about identifying things and coming to your boss with a problem and a solution, you can't do that on your own. You need people who are approaching it from perspectives other than your own. Yep. And if you don't put the time into building up those relationships, it's going to be much, much harder to have credibility when you come to a position like this than it would be otherwise. So with that, Andy, Julie, thank you so much for this fantastic conversation. This has been a tremendous amount of fun. Thank you to those of you who have tuned in. Live viewer numbers are through the roof, so that's a good thing to see. Thanks for all the activity on the back channel, and thanks for tuning in. My co-host, Kim Brown, who is in the air right now on her way here, we'll be back at the end of April with another show about live video on social. I would imagine that some Facebook Live will be talked about there in addition to some Meerkat and some Periscope. That's it from here at UCLA. Thanks for tuning in and see you next time.